Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the difference between a fight scene that you would find within North American comics or animation as opposed to a fight scene you would find within anime and manga. Now, quite honestly, I see the difference and distinction between the two as being boiled down to a difference between how each culture thinks about power and an individual's relation to power. So, just to let you know right off the bat, yes, I will be talking about this difference between the fight scenes within each of these mediums, but at the same time, I got to go deep into the ideas of power and the individual. Now, first off, I like to also look at the context within all of this before we get even to those points. And the context is, why in the world am I even asking this question to begin with? What's the underlying assumption and motivation that is there when I ask this question? Well, quite honestly, all of my videos may seem like a haphazard jumble of different ideas, but it's always what I'm thinking about when I'm trying to understand how to make comics. Because I make comics. I have one published graphic novel, which is a superhero graphic novel, Thomas Valiant. I have a second superhero graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes, which is still up on Indiegogo, that you can order and will be published at the end of summer, early fall this year. And I have a fantasy graphic novel, the campaign for which will be going up in about 6 days. I'll show you some art for all of those in the background, and the links are in the description for each of those and in the pinned comment. And by the way, if you want to sign up for CROM the Destroyer early, which is what that link is, you will receive an email when the project goes live and a free pinup poster with your order. But the point is, I make comics now, and even though I only made one graphic novel, my graphic novels are indeed 66 to 84 pages long, so that's the size of an entire story arc within mainstream comics. It's 3 to 4 floppies, so there's that. But at the same time, as I said, all the things that I think about and do videos about is how do I make comics better? Or at the very least, looking at the current industry, whether it be within North America or Japan, and say, what's the problem with this or that? And therefore, I do a video on the problems so I don't actually get ensnared by these problems because I try to boil them down to the very essence of where they come from. And the reason why I want to distinguish between a fight scene within comics as opposed to manga, which can also be translated into animation versus anime, is the fact that one of the backup stories for The Valiant Heroes is a story that was handled by a manga studio. It has the characters of Artemis and Cardinal, and I intend to do, probably in the next year or 2 years, a full graphic novel with these two characters, and their setting is Japan, and I've already used a manga artist for that. I think I'll do it in a manga way, using manga artists, actual manga artists, not these faux North American manga artists. So I'd like to figure out some of these distinguishing qualities, especially within a fight scene, because my books are all about action. Secondly, I'll have to note that whenever I do a video that focuses even remotely on anime and manga, people just pile on in the comments. That's okay. I really don't mind. It gives me different perspectives on what I'm talking about. And at the same time, I'm acknowledging right now my limitations. I think that most people who analyze anime and manga, who are Westerners and do so on the internet, the problem is that, yeah, they're just going off of analysis as a Westerner and not recognizing the fact that they have that limitation. I'm doing the same thing, but at the very least, I'm recognizing my limitations. So, in talking about my limitations and the limitations that everyone points out within my videos, a lot of people telling me, educate yourself about anime and manga before you speak about it. That's what I've been doing for well over a year now. And there's some things that I always want to bring up because, again, these are my biases that I'm going to have to navigate around when I actually talk about the things in this video. Number one being that you have a lot of anime and manga people who are North American and European admirers of anime and manga, and they keep on saying that this quote-unquote woke culture of North America is never going to infect anime and manga, and that's why they actually watch it or read it. When I tried to point out then afterwards, I'm sorry, but you do realize that you are that infection itself. Since you are not Japanese and you're making yourself a fan of this part of Japanese culture, you're entering into it these Western ideas, which is the bleeding in of this woke ideology. And quite honestly, since I have dealt with a manga studio and I have spoken with some manga creators, actual manga creators, again, not faux manga creators from North America, they have told me that whenever I say things like, yeah, anime and manga are woke, they're just not woke in a way that North Americans recognize it, because the idea of woke, the idea of progressivism, is all based upon an inculturation. That is to say, it uses the culture that it is expressed in. And so people, at least a few of them who make manga, say, yeah, you're actually right when you say things like anime and manga are already woke. It's just that North Americans don't recognize it because it's not a North American or European kind of woke. Although I would say they're probably far behind us in that expression within their culture and within their entertainment. It hasn't gotten to the level that you see within entertainment within North America and Europe right now. And do I have anything to support this idea, this bias, besides my own personal experience? Well, yeah, actually something funny. The funny thing is that a lot of people, when telling me that I need to go educate myself about anime and manga, told me to start with reading a book by Hiroki Azuma, that's the best I can pronounce that, which is called Otaku, Japan's Database Animals. And the thing is that this is a guy, he's a professor who works in a Japanese university, born and bred in Japan. He's studying otaku as a part of his professorship. And again, he's talking about people who consume anime and manga, and the entire idea, even the title itself, as Japan's Database Animals. That means that what he's talking about, and he states this directly, is that otaku are enculturated into postmodernism, because the idea of a database animal is postmodernism. And what is postmodernism? Well, it's a French reflection of German critical theory, which itself is a reflection of Marxist ideology, and the way that this Marxist ideology came into Western culture, which is what we see within all of our entertainment right now, is through postmodernism. And that's the origin of woke, quote-unquote, progressive culture. And while I don't take what Azuma says as gospel, at the very least, again, I'm listening to the person everyone told me to listen to and everyone pointed me towards, and I'm taking what he says as being at the very least possible, and he's saying, yeah, this is all postmodernism. All of anime and manga are based upon postmodernism. Although, again, there's limitations in my knowledge there because I've read interviews with this man, and he says this book that he put out, which most people consume, is just the light version of what he actually talks about in his main books, and he laments the fact that no one else is going to read the actual main books where these ideas come from, but I don't have access to them because, as far as I know, they're only in Japanese. And simply, I don't read Japanese. And I say all that because it leads into my next point, which again is something that's going to support the ideas of how to interpret the difference between a fight scene in comics versus manga, animation versus anime. A lot of people have asked me to analyze Eastern storytelling and how it is different from Western storytelling. And what they're really asking me is, what's the difference between anime and manga and a North American comic or television show, which is animation? Well, here's the thing. There might not be that much difference, because if my look into Japanese culture as it is expressed through literature is actually correct, and again, this is coming from Japanese authors and Japanese analysis, what they say is that at the point of World War II being over with the defeat of Japan, there was a massive shift within the culture in Japan, and it is expressed quite specifically within the literature, in that the main outside influence on Japan shifted quite drastically from that of China to Western cultures, with a heavy tinge of the American culture being prevalent. And this is usually analyzed by looking at, well, not just one author, but I would say preeminent among the group of authors of this time would be a man called Shusaku Endo. And again, best I can do with the pronunciation. And the reason why he is a good example of this entire thing was the fact that he himself, although he was a Japanese man born and bred, he was a Christian, he was a Catholic, and he was able to analyze, as it were, his own culture, both from the perspective of the culture itself and from an outside perspective. And just in case you're wondering, by the way, there is a very small but very strong Catholic community within Japan, and it has existed there since the Middle Ages. I think it was Francis of Assisi that put it there. So Endo's writings are taken as one of the key elements within this changeover from a Chinese mindset within literature to a Western mindset within literature. and it focuses very much in his work by an expression of ideas of religion, spirituality, ethics, good and evil, and how these things relate to the human being and the human individual. And not only that, but within his writing and the writing of the people around him during that time, which is basically the 50s, you have a movement of how to tell a story into a Western way to tell a story. That is to say, instead of having this impersonal way, this Chinese way of telling a story, he and the writers around him moved into a first-person perspective, which gives you much more of a concentration on the individual. And there's a further movement into the Western way of telling a story, which again, I'm always talking about. I can trace back at the very least to Aristotle in the 4th century BC, who himself is describing this according to stories that were generated from history as far back as 1200 BC, which is to say that a story is a representation of reality and a rhetorical argument at the same time. You have this kind of idea moving into the Japanese literature at that time because, again, Endo and the other writers around him are using, or at the very least, attempting to use and explore and reveal the underlying reasons behind human existence and actions and all that kind of thing. So why am I saying all that? Well, because number one, it's my recognition of my limitations in understanding what is going on within anime and manga and its creation, because I can tell you right now, I'm not going to lay this down and say, this is exactly how it works. No, this is my Western interpretation of some kinds of Eastern storytelling. But at the very least, you have to realize that that Eastern form of storytelling, as analyzed by Japan itself, has a recognition that it is a Western form of storytelling. And you have all of that buttressed by the ideas of Azuma, who's talking specifically about anime and manga, saying it's an expression of a European idea, which is postmodernism. And so if we look at all that, there is an underlying strain which connects all of these things. And that underlying strain is a difference in the way that each culture, Western and Eastern, looks at power and its relation to the individual. Because again, this is part of what Endo himself was trying to express within his writings, and those writers around him were doing the same thing within that changeover to a Western form of storytelling, while at the same time you have Azuma talking about postmodernism, which itself is talking about systems of power. So it would be my assertion, and what I'm building this video on, is the idea that when you have a visual representation of power within something like a fight scene, you have to look at how that power is viewed by each of those cultures, because even though we have within anime and manga, and even just general literature itself within Japan, an enculturation into the Western form of storytelling for the last 75 years, there's still an underlying difference between how each of these cultures expresses and deals with the idea of power. And in order to do that, in order to look at this difference between those two expressions of power, I have to look at each culture and what they see as the ultimate power, which is going to bring me into philosophy and theology. And I'm sorry for those people who don't believe in Christianity and are a little sick of me talking about it on my channel, but the very fact of the matter is that you can't look at Western culture without understanding some of the theological principles of Christianity. You just can't. You can't have Western culture without those principles. Everything around you is built upon those principles. The idea of education and post-secondary education and universities come from the medieval creation of the university, which is based upon Christian principles. The idea of medicine and hospitals that we have them today, they're all based upon this medieval creation of an institution which is based upon Christian theology and principles. The dollar bill in your pocket and the monetary systems that we use are all developed through an expression, a wide expression, by the way, of Christian principles and how they were developed within the Middle Ages. All of our political institutions, especially the idea of rights, are based upon Christian ideas that were developed within the Middle Ages. Even the way that we speak, and I keep talking about this on my channel, very simple concepts and words that we use, like will, you can trace that very directly back to the 4th century AD with Augustine of Hippo, giving a very Christian tinge to the entire thing, which separates the idea of will before him and after him. Why? Because before him was much more a Roman and Greek way of thinking about the will, which was not completely separate from what we have right now, but had some very different ideas attached to it, whereas Augustine of Hippo said, no, those things are not true. This is how we should define will, and it is according to some ideas of the will which are tied to Christian theology, and it has come with us straight through to today. So if you ever use the word will or shall or won't or I'll or you'll or anything like that, you're expressing an idea of will which is based upon Christian theology. You just are. So you can't extract Christian theology from Western civilization without first A, completely destroying that civilization, and B, trying to create something entirely new, which some people would say, this is what your quote-unquote progressive woke people are trying to do. But even there, no, because their ideas, whether they come out of Nietzsche or Rand or back to Marx or anything, all of those people base their ideas on the Christian theology. They just flipped it on its head. That all being said, I'll try to get through this with some speed. So the idea of where all power comes from, according to Christian theology, is of course God, and that God created the universe. It's not a part of him, not like in the Eastern tradition. Within the Western tradition, God creates the universe out of nothing, and the only reason it exists and continues to exist at every moment is because he wills it to continue to exist at every moment. And the expression of that itself is the fact that he gives principles to things, he gives natures to things, that they exist according to those principles and natures which are in themselves unchangeable, which again is a direct contradiction of the Eastern way of looking at things with its idea of non-self. And what more, the Christian idea of God is a person. Well, it's actually 3 people with one essence, but I'm not getting into that can of worms. So we'll just call it a person. So their expression of God is a person. So it's a personal thing. That person is actually connecting to you, an individual person. So this entire relation between those 2 persons is actually something which is key to how power is expressed and transmitted from that larger person of God to the smaller person of any human individual. And how does that power transmit from that first principle to individuals, which are human beings? Well, it transmits that way by those individuals doing the will of God. This is what Christianity is based upon. The most basic prayer is the Our Father, which states, "Thy will be done," which is to say, the will of God be done through me. And again, one quick note there, which got to go into Christian theology, this is not a submersion of the individual so that the individual no longer exists and their individual will doesn't have any marks of an individual that we would think of itself. No, it's quite the opposite. The idea is that when an individual wills themselves to do the will of God, he becomes self-actualized as an individual more than he can ever become in himself. The whole idea goes back to the story of Moses and the burning bush. You have this burning bush which was not consumed. Why is it not consumed? Well, fire is taken as a representation of ultimate realization of power. It takes potential power and turns it into actual power. And here you see the presence of God is turning this wood into actual power, which in itself is burning, but is never consumed. So the whole idea is the same thing with a human being. If a person does the will of God, their individuality is not consumed by the will of God itself. It becomes the greatest expression of that individual will itself without ever being consumed. And how does this happen? Well, again, it's the thing I'm always talking about. It's an expression of the human will and their will to do what is virtuous, because those virtues themselves are an act of the will, which is supposed to have the truth at its center, which is an expression of God, which is where power itself is, all of that. And if you want to take all that and think about it in a pop culture way, just think of the idea of Green Lantern. Here you have a character who is a superhero who has a power ring, which is powered by a power battery. And how does he actually use this power? Well, it's through his will. Anything that he can will, he can make into an actual construct, as an expression of that power. And by the way, Christianity and Eastern ways of looking at things, which would mostly be Buddhism, have a similar idea of a reflection of power through the individual, which is where the fight scene whole thing comes in. But the reflection of power through the individual, but in a very different and distinct way. Because there are these, we'll call them powers, that you can have as a human being according to doing the will of God. Some of them quite fantastical, like healing others and reading hearts and all that kind of thing. But the expression, the greatest expression of that power is prophecy, which is not what most people think. It's not seeing the future. It's understanding God's plan for the entire creation in a way that you can express it to others and help them come to their greatest end, which is to say within Christianity is salvation. So again, the point why I bring that up is because you see how it's all individual, individual, individual. The individual, God, who is a person, transmits this power to an individual person, and the best use of that power by the individual person is to use it to express that will to others as individuals for the greatest good of those individuals, so on and so forth. So it's power plus the individual, always. And again, this is expressed within Western ideas like the idea of rights, which Eastern cultures had no idea of and actually fought against right up until about the creation of the League of Nations, where they said, no, we don't have any notion of rights. That's not part of our cultures. But it was forced upon them with the creation of the League of Nations. But the idea of rights itself, the natural law idea of rights, is that each individual is a locus of intrinsic value. Locus being a Latin word, which basically means location, but it's more than that. We'll just leave it at location, but is a locus of intrinsic value. Again, you see how this trickles down to the individual and how that individual is unique and is protected by these expressions of power within creation. And again, this comes into pop culture ideas, just through superheroes like Spider-Man and Superman. What is Spider-Man built upon? The idea that with great power comes great responsibility. Again, you see power linked to the individual because the individual has to be responsible for that power. Or the ideas of Superman. It is truth, justice in the American way. What's the American way? Well, the American way is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the pursuit of happiness? Well, that, again, is an expression of natural law, saying that each of us should pursue our own individual ends as they were created and expressed because, again, Christian culture going right through the founding documents of America, we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, so that expression of the pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of your ends that are set up by this Creator. So once again, we see power as it is trickling down towards individuals and individual use. And by the way, this is why I did more than one video on that idea of Gene Yang at DC Comics trying to get rid of the American way within the title of Superman and replace it with tolerance. Why? Because he's a heavy progressive, and the idea of progressive tolerance will not tolerate the idea of the American way, because baked within it is this idea of unalienable rights and how this power trickles down to each individual, which is something that progressivism doesn't want you to have. It wants you to treat individuals as part of a collective whole. But anyway, so let's take all that and use it as a backdrop to analyze the most prevalent idea of power within Eastern cultures, which would be expressed in, well, however you see it, either the religion or the philosophy of Buddhism. The differences being, starting from the very first, that this ultimate power of God is not a personal thing. It's much more akin to the idea of the Force. Before you introduce the idea of the midichlorians, it's a giant battery that powers the entire universe and is indeed the entire universe itself at the same time. It's not separate like the Christian idea. And some of the principles that derive from that is the Buddhist idea, again, of non-self, which is to say, you don't have anything fixed within you, like the idea of a human nature within Western culture. It is just a collection of forces that plays together in order to generate the self, and you should actually try to divest yourself of that self or that individual, or even thinking about those things, because all it's going to bring you is pain and suffering. So what you want to do is divest yourself of all of these ideas of individuality and self itself under the idea of non-self. I know that's terribly confusing. It is for me anyways, and I probably expressed it in a confusing way, but it's the best I got. And this entire thing plays into how an individual actually accesses power. Because first of all, if you're part of the universe and the universe itself is part of this giant force, this giant battery, then you have access to that power. But how do you have access to that power? It's through a series of realizations that you yourself as an individual basically don't matter. Or at the very least, a series of realizations which realize the fact that in order to become one with the universe, you need to divest yourself of these individual parts of you more and more. So again, to bring in some pop culture references to this, look at something like Sword Art Online, the very first arc anyways, where Kirito dies. And this, by the way, is just an example. There are plenty of examples exactly like this within anime and manga. But the fact is that when he dies within the game, he's supposed to be dead. For everyone else, they die. But he doesn't die. He actually comes back to life. Why? Because he has a self-realization that is dependent upon his idea of friendship and all this connection with his love for others. It's a self-realization. It would make sense more to an Eastern audience than to a Western audience. To a Western audience, that looks like plot armor, and it's just being pulled out of a hat because he's the main character, therefore he can't die. But to an Eastern sensibility, it's that, no, see, he has this self-realization which allows him access to more power, and that power, which by the way is represented by the fact that he's in a simulation itself, which is kind of how they see reality, according to Buddhist principles. Well, once he has that, he has access to power, which makes sure that he can go back and not actually die. Now, that's a little bit of a complicated example of that. Let's look at a more simple example. You look at something like Dragon Ball Z, where you have these characters which keep on leveling up, and there is no final form, even though they keep saying final form. There is no final form. They can keep on leveling up. So you have a hero which gets defeated by a villain because the villain has leveled up, and then the hero must level up even more, and it just continues on and on and on and on. Well, this is an expression of this Eastern sensibility of power as connected to the individual as part of a self-realization, which allows them power or access to the power of the universe itself, and therefore they can become more and more and more powerful. Quite honestly, I'm not a big Dragon Ball Z fan in any way. To me, a more pure example of this entire thing would be the manga and then anime of Claymore, especially because within that you have a lot of things that I've been talking about. You have an anime, which is then turned into a manga, so it's both at the same time, and you have this entire story being told in these Western ways of thinking and acting and presenting the characters and the culture and everything else, because it's a story written in basically a continental medieval European culture. Something like France or Germany within the Middle Ages, probably more Germany. So you have a European setting with characters that act in a European way and ideas that are dealt with in a European way. And if you're a European, you can access this story really easily, even though the fight scenes, and there's plenty of them, are expressed, again, in an Eastern way. Because when you get to the very end of what is basically the anime, not sure if I remember where that comes within the manga itself, but anyways, the end of the anime, to me, that falls down completely flat, even though the entire anime itself was fairly good. Why? Because again, it relies on this Eastern trope of continually being able to power up. Because just like in Dragon Ball Z, you have the main heroes of the story and one very specifically that you're concentrating on, and they all get defeated by these giant, massively powerful demons. And then this one woman, who's not a particularly strong woman, not even compared to her comrades, the other heroes around her, she has a self-realization moment which allows her access to power, basically tapping into the power of the universe, which allows her to be more powerful than these giant, powerful demons and so destroy them. So again, let's take all of that and apply it to a fight scene itself and how it is expressed within visual representations within sequential art. Because that's what both Western comics and Eastern manga are, and they continue and are brought into animation in their various forms. Well, the thing is that when you have a battle scene with two individuals within Western comics, since that access to power is an individual access to power, and they utilize it in a way that is connected to the virtues, which allows them access to that power, again, being an act of the will, which connects them to something higher, then it is an expression of power which is, like rights itself, focused on the locus of the individual, and in this case, the skill of the individual and their ability to access that skill through what? Well, through the virtues. Why? The virtue of prudence is correct decision making, so you make correct decisions with your skill, and therefore you actually end up winning the battle. That's why you have the virtuous hero and the vice-ridden villain who gets defeated. And the visual representation of that entire thing within sequential art is once again to show the skill of the individual and how it counters the skill of the person who is the villain. Again, it is much more focused on the individual themselves and how they can fight and what they do to express that conflict through individual skill. Now, of course, I'm not making a blanket statement saying every fight scene is this, but I'm saying that's the basic norm of the fight scenes within North American comics. And the same goes for what I'm about to say about a fight scene within anime and manga. If you look at a fight scene within manga and you understand that the access to power of the individual is through their realization and their ability to tap into the power of the universe, what you're typically going to see within the sequential art is not a focus on the individual, but a focus on the power itself. Or to put it another way, within comics, it is the individual as they are utilizing power, but within manga, it is power as it is utilizing the individual. Let's take for our example within manga, One Punch Man. You have this character who is so strong that at times when he punches, you see this expression of power that is so massive and great that he's not even in the panel. Or if he is, he's just a tiny little speck. Because that's the entire point. You see, it's about the power itself and the expression of that power. If you see the continent being shaken by one of his punches, or maybe even the entire planet, there is no access to him within that visual representation. He's too small. It is a representation and focus on the power itself. And you can look at the same thing within sword battles within various kinds of manga. So often you don't see the sword strike itself, which would be what you would focus on within comics, because the sword strike is the representation of the skill of the individual. Instead, within manga, you see the result of the sword strike. The sword strike itself is just a blur of action, and then you see someone cleft in two, because that cleft in two is an expression of that power. Or again, you see something like a flurry of blows, and it's just a blur of movement within, let's say, One Punch Man. It's just a blur of fists all coming towards his opponent. There's no actual skill depicted in any one of those blows, nor within One Punch Man himself, which is just a character that is dependent upon one kind of attack, which is one punch. Why? Because you don't have to concentrate on skill in any way. You have to concentrate on the expression of power. And again, those multiple fists coming at an opponent in any manga is just an expression of power. This is the difference of how you represent a fight and how a fight plays out within manga as opposed to North American comics. Now, off of that, I want to answer one further question. My further question is that since manga is kicking comics butt right now, a lot of people are saying we need to take a manga way of representing these things and tell these stories in a manga way, and therefore we'll draw in that audience. I don't think that's a good idea at all. We might utilize some of the things that manga uses in order to tell a story, but I don't think a North American or European audience is going to take to a complete imposition of how to create a comic the manga way onto comics. It's just not going to work. And I think we see it not working over and over again within the comics that we see within our entertainment today. And my assertion there, and that's all it is, it's an assertion on my part, is the fact that, first of all, again, you see these different expressions of power and how these ideas are really not going to play out in a positive way within the North American mind, because we have very fundamental differences in how we would visualize something like a fight. But at the same time, you have to understand that if we take as true all of that stuff that I talked about literature and about otaku culture and how it's really an expression of Western ideas in an Eastern way, and that they've done this for the last 75 years, we can see that, yeah, they're very good at doing this. And they're doing it in a way that they're taking North American and European storytelling and making it their own in some way. Again, having 75 years to do that. But more than that, there is looking at the Japanese way of dealing with external things and the North American way of dealing with external things. And I'm looking only at North America, because if you look at Japan, it's an island nation. They are constantly thinking in the back of their minds, how do we survive as a small island nation? And so they have to adopt idea after idea from the outside when it is something that will benefit them. Which, again, I would assert is what they did within storytelling itself. But that's not the way North Americans think. North Americans come up with a problem and say, okay, I don't like the way this is going. If I want to survive, I'll just pick up and move. It's the frontier mentality. So that's why I would say taking an anime and manga style and just imposing it upon North American entertainment is not going to work. But at the same time, the reverse does work. If, again, what I'm saying is correct, and for the last 75 years, you have Japan taking Western storytelling and Western ideas, which, again, you look at 90s anime and you can just see this through and through. But anyway, if you take all of that as true, you'll see that they're going to have much more of a mind towards accepting these ideas and making them their own, which is to say, they don't want a reflection of their own ideas back at them, which is what they're doing to American culture. No, if North American culture and comics and entertainment itself wants to sell to an Eastern audience, what it needs to do is to get back to its roots. What it needs to do is get back to that good old trope of nothing but Americana. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this, and I'm sure I'm going to get plenty of comments disagreeing with me. That's quite fine. I like to expand my horizons wherever I can. And at the same time, remember that the links are in the description and in the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. CROM the Destroyer will be opening this coming Friday. If you sign up on that early bird sign up page, link in the description, you will get a reminder email when we go live and a free pinup poster with your order. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.